I'm Kai, a 9-year-old artist from the UK currently working on one shot with Viz. Please consider subscribing. I make videos every Monday. In this video I'll be going over basic backgrounds, but rather than showing you things like perspective, other people have good videos on those already. I'm going to talk about what I'm thinking about when I'm actually drawing a background, and hopefully that will help you out a lot. If you're looking for videos on perspective, David Finch, Draw Like a Sir have good videos on it already, so I'd suggest checking those out before, if you don't know what perspective is, before watching this video. So I'll get into drawing some super basic backgrounds and show you the process of that. First, I always suggest finding some reference, because if you're drawing for your memory, and you're just starting out with backgrounds especially, and it's something that you're not comfortable with, your background's never going to look good like that. It's better to sort of, use reference, whether that be real life reference or references from, manga or comics. I mean, I suggest using references from manga and comics just because it's always going to be a lot easier than trying to copy something that already exists, because you also have to stylize sort of the background that you're creating too, so that it matches the characters, and it can be a lot more difficult if you don't know how to stylize it, or you're trying to stylize something that already exists and you have no particular direction with the style that you're trying to go for your backgrounds. First I'm just laying out some super basic perspective. I don't usually draw the perspective grids or anything, especially now. I kind of just eyeball it. And I'm always thinking about sort of the lighting scenario that I'm going to do when I'm drawing these sort of backgrounds. Typically, I'm trying to figure out where the shadows are going to go. Since the lighting, I'm going to make it come from sort of this direction. Everything that is on this side is going to be super light, and naturally everything that is on this side is going to be darker. So these parts will be in screen tone or hatching, depending on the style you want to go for. Something I keep in mind. At this beginning stage, I'm just laying everything out for when I want to go over with inks later, but it doesn't have to be perfect or anything like that. So essentially now I might tighten up a few things and make it more how the perspective is meant to go in this angle before I actually go over with inks. And while I'm doing this too, I'm also sort of thinking about, as I talked about earlier, where I'm going to lay down my screen tones. For example, in this part here, since this is further away, I'm thinking of putting more screen tone back here. Sort of if it was super far away, you might just make it fully black. And especially if you're going to be drawing sort of a character here or something, this is going to help them stand out a lot more, just because this is the darker part here, and this is where the character is standing, and it's going to make them pop out a lot more, especially because here they won't be super dark, they're going to be light, and so their contrast is going to stand out a lot more. On top of that, I'm also thinking about where I'm going to put my character sort of on the page. For example, since this is a one-point perspective, what you can actually do is use sort of leading lines to make the character stand out in a space. For example, if I laid out a perspective here and I put the character on top of this point, all the lines will converge towards the point, but also towards the character, and that's going to help them stand out a lot more. For example, if I put the character here, the character is really going to stand out in the scene, and they're going to be the first thing that you look at, because all the lines are pointing directly towards the character, on top of the contrast back here, helping the character stand out a lot more. And since I would consider this sort of good enough to ink directly from, I'll start doing that now, and I'll run you through sort of what I'm thinking about when I'm inking it too. First I'm going to turn down the contrast a lot. Essentially I only want this to be a guide or base. I don't want it to be super dark and sort of control how I'm going to approach inking it. But I'll lay down my basic sort of perspective rulers. For me personally, my backgrounds aren't necessarily always in perfect perspective because they don't really need to be to sort of work. The only thing we have to think about as mangaka is just like if it works, if it looks good. It doesn't always have to be, perfect. We're not like architects or anything. So whatever makes the scene look the best that it can look, I think that's what you should do. Obviously, when you're starting out, it's better to sort of follow the simple perspective, just because it's always going to be a lot easier than trying to make stuff up. Rather than always going fully black, sometimes putting a little bit of hatching makes the scene a lot more detailed. Because if you really think about it, the more lines you use, typically that's how detailed a thing is. So the more lines you use, the more detailed your thing is, essentially. Here I'm going to be putting sort of hatching plus screen tone. So the way I'm going to approach it is just using super thin lines, sort of like this. And they don't necessarily have to connect or anything like that. Essentially, it's just to add a little bit more texture and detail. On top of that, just adding a few extra sort of lines to add a bit more detail. It's always good. And if you're a bit confused on sort of the way that I'm laying out where I'm going to put my screen tone, it's basically just like if you was drawing a square, that would be the sort of door, and you would put screen tone or hatching or both on this side. Early on it's better to establish what you're going to put down, if it's going to be screen tone or hatching, because depending on the lines that you put here is going to affect whether or not screen tone is going to work here. And while I do this too, I'm also adding and taking away things from the sketch that I already did, depending on what would look better inked up. Just because when I'm sketching, typically I'm just adding in a few random things to sort of fill space, and sometimes it's not needed as much in sort of when I'm actually inking, or maybe I need to add more to a certain area and things like that. And usually when I do floors or ceilings, and a lot of other places too, I'll do a thicker line accompanied by a smaller line, or thinner line, just because I'm not really sure why, but I see a lot of mangaka do it. Maybe it's because of sort of lighting and how it sort of affects the certain ridges of backgrounds, but I'm not quite sure either, which is partly why I didn't want to make this a how-to, just because I don't know everything or close to everything about this either. A lot of the things I just copy from other mangaka and then I implement into my own stuff, which is why I guess studying for real life on occasion is good too, just because you start to figure out why certain things exist. I mean, manga itself is just a stylization of reality anyway, so things that exist in manga and comics is typically something that already exists in real life too. It's just stylized to an extent. When I'm drawing these two, what can happen is the background can end up feeling a little plain. Typically what you want to do is add in more black. Typically you hope the screen toning phase fixes it, but if it doesn't fix the problem, then typically you have to go in with a few darker lines and make things a bit darker. Generally, having a good contrast in your backgrounds is what you want to go for, because if everything feels a certain way, unless it's intentional and you have a reason for it, then things can end up feeling super plain. But in this kind of scene, once you start adding characters and school kids walking around, it should typically fix the problem anyway. I'm going to go over some basic screen tone, and after I do this, typically there are additional edits that I have to make depending on how it's screen tone. So yeah. Typically with my screen tone I use an 80 frequency because it's the smallest. This room here seems to have the problem that I was talking about earlier, where there's not enough black. So what I'll do here is add more black to the sort of background itself, or to this specific part, and it should hopefully fix the problem that I'm having here. And if not, regardless, I think with how I personally would draw it, there's going to be some kind of school kid sort of blocking this area anyway. Typically I don't even draw the full background itself because there's not really much of a reason to. Typically it's covered by speech bubbles or characters anyway, so you don't really need to draw the whole background unless you're doing studies or something. Essentially, since I want to add some texture now, I'm gonna make some texture on the floor here. This is a texture that I learned from DD when I was looking at his work, but a lot of different mangakas actually do this in different ways, in different stylized ways. But DD is the easiest way I found to do it, which is to sort of put down these super basic thin lines, as thin as you want. I would use a DD reference, one from his Spider-Man one shot, and then you'll be able to find sort of the technique I'm talking about. Essentially you put down these thinner lines, and when you have all that down, essentially you want to soften up some parts of this background or these lines that you created with a soft eraser, and then it creates a sort of a good texture here. And when you draw characters on top of this, give me a second. Essentially, once I've this is a super basic character, but once I establish them down, typically what you want to do is to show they're reflecting off, because the floor is reflective. Drawing something like this, sort of this kind of shape that's sort of in the basic silhouette of the character, and starting from super dark and then going to super light shades. You can do this with gradients too. That's what DD does, but I prefer to do it with hatching. And as you go lighter as you go further down, because it gets further away from the character, but essentially like this, and the floor looks a lot more reflective like this. Since this is still feeling a little plain right now, what could be good to do is add in a few characters to really make the scene feel less empty. What I typically like to do is put stuff in the foreground too. So a good rule of thumb is to put something in the foreground, you got something middle, and then you have something in your background. Essentially, having things overlap makes the scene have more depth, and this can make short of your backgrounds and scenes look a lot more interesting, in my opinion. In addition to also using foregrounds, you can also change the contrast on the foreground, and then this is going to look like one big shape. And then the background here will be a lot lighter, and this will automatically draw attention as opposed to this. But this contrast here can be lighter. Typically it's darker though. In a lot of manga you'll see a darker thing in the foreground. In comics too. Typically in comics it's jet black, but in manga sometimes it's actually just screen toned out, so you might have a sort of larger screen tone here, maybe a 30. Yeah, something to keep in mind. And here's sort of the basic characters that I laid out in the scene. They're not designed to be perfect or anything, they're just to get the idea across. What you can also do is actually sort of highlight the main character, and sometimes side characters too, in like, white outline. A lot of mangakas actually do this to sort of highlight the character, so it can be good to do. Like so. On top of that, what we'll also do, just so I can give you an idea of what you might actually see in the background, I'll add in some speech bubbles. And this is how the background will look. Essentially I will be adding a few more details, some additional blacks. Sometimes you have to wait until after you put the characters in to realize where you need to add more detail or take away more detail, or where you need to add more blacks for contrast and things like that. But yeah, essentially this is how I draw my basic background. If you liked the video, like and subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.